Hello folks. Let's talk a little bit about 4K resolution for video. 4K UHD, or ultra high definition, has 4 times the number of pixels compared to 1080p HD. The extra resolution can provide more detail and can allow for viewing a larger display without looking pixelated. It can also allow for more digital cropping in post with less loss of clarity. While most people don't really need 4K, it does provide benefits in some situations. I reviewed a few off-brand 4K camcorders. Sure, they might have their drawbacks and some of them aren't particularly inexpensive, but they have 4K video and you can't get a name brand camcorder with 4K video for the same price. You're getting a more detailed image for your money versus a similarly priced 1080p camera. Or are you? One might reasonably assume that if 2 cameras both record at 4K, they would have similar detail. And the 4K camera will definitely have more detail than 1080p, right? Well, it's not quite that simple. There are many factors involved in capturing detail. Even if the output resolution is 4K, this doesn't guarantee the video will have a particular amount of detail. Resolution is just the number of pixels, and that's only part of the story. The lens, image sensor, processing, file codec, and the data rate all come into play when determining if there's unique information for each of those pixels. Unfortunately, this means we can't rely only on the fact that a camera is 4K as an indicator of how much detail it will capture. This also means that having 4K resolution shouldn't be used alone as a selling point. This really applies to any resolution, not just 4K. Not all 1080p cameras capture the same amount of detail either. It just seems more prevalent for cheap cameras to use 4K as a selling point these days. The point is, not all pixels are created equal. A camera won't necessarily give a particular amount of detail simply because it's 4K. Also, detail is only one part of what makes good image quality. But since detail is the only thing related directly to 4K resolution, that's the focus of this video. Here's a clip from a cheap action camera recorded at 4K resolution. But if you compare that to a 1080p clip from a more expensive camera, despite having 1/4 of the pixels, the 1080p clip has more detail, even when cropped in quite a bit. Here's a 4K clip from a generic camcorder that isn't all that inexpensive. Again, it's compared to 1080p footage from a more expensive camera. And again, it falls a bit short for actual detail. I'm not trying to convince you to spend more on a camera. I only want to demonstrate that simply having 4K doesn't mean a camera will capture as much detail as another 4K camera or even a good 1080p camera. This knowledge may allow you to spend less on a camera. If you're looking at a cheap 1080p camera, maybe it's not worth paying a bit more for a generic brand with 4K simply because it's 4K. That's not to say 4K will never have more detail. As I mentioned before, 4K does have 4 times as many pixels as 1080p. If the camera can provide those pixels with information and retain that information when compressing the video into a file, then 4K will be more detailed than a lower resolution. But failing that, the cheap 4K may not add much detail, if any at all. Here's another clip from the same cheap action camera, this time compared to a 4K clip from a GoPro Session, which is one of the cheaper GoPros. Particularly when cropped in, you can see that the increased resolution of 4K on the GoPro is giving a bit more detail than the 1080p mode. Switching back to the generic 4K camcorder, now we'll take a look at the 4K footage from this camcorder compared to 4K footage from the more expensive camera. When the more expensive camera is stepped up to 4K, there is an improvement in the amount of detail. Higher resolution can provide more detail, provided the rest of the system can provide more information to go along with the increased resolution. I know these aren't fair comparisons. I'm comparing cameras of very different prices, but that's kind of the point. If a generic or super cheap camera seems really inexpensive for a 4K camera, there's a good chance that the increased resolution isn't going to do you very much good. It doesn't mean you shouldn't buy a cheap camera if that's what you're looking for, but just be aware that Simply being 4K doesn't mean it's going to match 4K of a better camera. 4K UHD is such a recognizable standard for resolution that it makes a great standout spec to advertise. But it's also the kind of spec that can be increased on a camera without any appreciable benefit. Resolution is a meaningful spec. In some situations, it can be an indicator of detail potential that can be compared directly across other cameras. But be aware that particularly on the cheaper end, it may not mean quite as much as you think. These days, with 6K and even 8K starting to show up on everything from high-end cinema cameras to phones, it's important to understand the limits of resolution. Increasing the resolution doesn't necessarily equate to an equivalent increase in detail. It's just more pixels. Whether or not those pixels actually contain unique data is another story. It is a legitimate spec with genuine potential benefits, but it's also just one part of a much larger system that will determine overall image quality and even detail specifically. So take resolution specs with a pinch of salt and factor in the rest of the story before deciding if increased resolution adds any value for you or justifies an increased price in a given camera. If you have any questions or if there are any other tests or comparisons you'd like me to do, let me know. As always, thanks for watching. Take care.